Hello, everyone. This is Sleepy Reader. I'm a very important person. I have a YouTube channel with hundreds of subscribers and like maybe 30 or 40 viewers. So I'm gonna tell you who to vote for in the next upcoming election, and I'm gonna help you figure out how to solve all these Middle East problems I keep hearing about. But maybe in another video, because I have to check who's running for election. I don't really know. And there's some country in the Middle East right now that's having a bit of a problem, and yeah, I have to find out which country and who's having the problem. Anyway, in the meantime, I'll tell you about some comic books I read in recent weeks. It's going to be a bit of a hodgepodge, just throwing out at you what I managed. I'm disorganized, in other words. But solving world problems was kind of on the front of my mind, I guess, because I've been foolishly listening to the news lately a little bit. Look, I even have a cup that's about news. Haha. I actually don't listen to the news very much anymore. I used to listen to it a lot. It always seems the same to me now. But anyway, We Stand on Guard was a very good comic book. With art that didn't... The art by Steve Scroce, apparently some, legendary comic book artist coming back to comics. I'd never heard of him. And when I just glanced at the art, I wasn't that impressed. But somehow, reading this comic book, I really love the art. And now that I look at it again, I don't quite see why, although the colors by Matt Hollingsworth, not in his splatter mode, are really good here. I'm referring to his splatter mode in Witches, where he went insane with all this splattering. So I guess he's a good storyteller, even though his characters look kind of stiff. Maybe he's just right for this story, which has so much emotional stuff in it that his art lets us stand back from the emotion a bit. I think at the core of this issue is the gory... I don't even know whether I should show it. It might be upsetting to some people. There's a very gory picture of the father just before he dies, with his arm and his leg blown off and most of his skin blown off, telling his kids to take care of each other just before he dies. And the reason, it's emotionally very powerful, and it sets up the quest that the girl, once she grows up, goes through. It's a very obvious but nice scene that shows her as a little girl, and then we flash forward, and it just tells a lot right there, to when she's an adult carrying a gun out in the Canadian wilderness. So that's her arc right there, right? From her childhood, her parents, not to mention her city, and probably most of her friends killed by U.S. bombs, just randomly killing civilians for whatever good reason the U.S. felt it had, or bad reason it felt it had. So as I've said elsewhere, I'm really uncomfortable about the idea of a war between Canada and the U.S. I would be 100% against it, although I'm 99% against war. But I think that what he's up to here, what Brian K. Vaughan is up to here, is thinking about the Middle East and various places in Europe and Africa that we hear about, people who live very close to each other, fighting each other, people who get bombed, and perhaps that's how they get turned into freedom fighters and terrorists and other kinds of combatants in the future. And by placing it for us Americans and us Canadians anyway, right in our front yard, giving that experience a different twist. So like all science fiction is about now in some way, right? And this seems very expressly about the world that we live in, but maybe don't understand very much because we're in this protected suburban safe world that we live in. That by we, I mean us here in the United States anyway. I can't speak for everyone else. So I think that's what he's up to here. And while I dread being given the political lesson, I think he's doing it very well. And I'm on board. I think I heard this is a miniseries. As usual, Image does not show that things are a miniseries or not. But anyway, it really was a wonderful combination of words and pictures. A master, Brian K. Vaughan at work. I was expecting a belly flop for some reason. It just sounded like a story I didn't want to read. It's grim stuff, though, and it's very sad the way the world works. Sad when the U.S. or anyone else bombs someplace in hopes of achieving their political goals, their geopolitical goals, and civilians or other innocents are hurt. So all wars bad, wars that hurt. Collateral damage is even worse, and creates the next tragedy. Because the woman we see here, you might just think, you could interpret it, oh, she's just become real kick-ass in the sequence where she does something that the other people aren't expecting and she does easily. But I think that may be leading us more into what these events and things turn people into, and how the cycles continue. Anyway, that's how I'm interpreting this now. What it's about could change. It's funny, the back matter is kind of jokey about jokey conflicts between, how the Canadians and Americans tease each other. But that's an entirely different thing than the kind of story we get here. It's how once you start a cycle of violence, what that leads to. And it's interesting because, oh, darn it, do I have it here? The most recent Saga addressed, violence has been in the background of Saga, and there's been a lot of violence in Saga, but has seemed to focus on other kinds of things, but in the background is this cycle of violence also between these two planets and in these people's lives. And this issue of Saga addressed that more clearly with Marco and Alana and other characters sort of still involved in the cycle of violence. But much further away, not nearly as close to home, so not maybe driving its lesson home as hard, and having all kinds of other cliches and tropes that we don't get, that can distract us. Like right after we kind of have some powerful moments about violence, we have Prince Robot coming in and being just like a regular stage villain again, I thought. So that's kind of a mixed bag. Saga's endless twists and turns have kind of, in a way, at this point, my gosh, we're on issue 30. We've been reading this for 3 years, I think. We're kind of used to it, and so I don't feel that heartbroken feeling that the mother and father are separated once again from their child. But I still want them all to get together, and I still want to keep reading Saga, but it just doesn't have the impact it might have once had. Okay, and in the political range is Omega Men. This was a very powerful issue, much better than issue 1, although I liked issue 1. We get more of a sense of the universe that we're in. I know this is part of the DC universe with a Green Lantern, but it's a story universe that we really haven't been in before. The art was great, in an unflashy kind of way, just telling the story. The the techniques that Tom King, I think his name is Tom King likes to use, and that his artist is helping him with, are formal, mildly experimental storytelling techniques, and done really successfully and really well. And this has a kind of twist where you feel you feel a bit of relief that our heroes are being heroic, but then we're twisted away from that again. They aren't quite as evil as they seemed in the first issue, and the evil empire is more evil. But the cost and the sacrifices and the need to not care about human life, or in the case of this with alien sentient life, in a violent struggle, are here. This is a very sobering book still. The interesting thing to me, amongst other things, is I've heard interviews with Tom King, and he worked for the CIA. He volunteered after 9/11, or not volunteered, but I mean he joined up the CIA in 9/11 and has been a field operative in the Middle East and in European areas. And he says he's very proud of his work with the CIA. Whereas a book like this makes me think that it feels like it's written by someone who thinks neither side is good. But it'd be interesting to see how that plays out more. So Omega Men is sort of at the top of my stack of DC Comics right now. Looking for a better segue. Okay, well, totally light, but also near the top of my stack of DC Comics right now is Bizarro. I thought issue 2 was even funnier than issue 1. It's very light on its feet. It's kind of experimental in its own way. Just like the Tom King stuff, it does little formal experiments, but it will jump around to different, temporary experiments, on a page here or there, telling its story in different ways. And I think that works really well with this kind of humor. If it was all told in one way, the humor would lose its zip and zing. There's a lot of really cool playing with the way Bizarro talks, and commentary from Jimmy Olsen, where he says, well, what did you say? Was that the way you're supposed to say it? Because sometimes everything Bizarro says is reversed, but sometimes it's just bad grammar and stuff, and they joke around about that. Plus, there's these fun artist cameos. There's Batman by Kelly Jones, one of my favorite Batman artists. And we get The Flash done by Francis Manapul, a great Flash artist. And so, yeah. Oh, there's more. I love these photograph things because it is Jimmy Olsen, right? He's a photographer, and he's sort of our guide through the story. So, loving Bizarro. If you can grab the issues easily without a lot of expense, do it. It's just a fun time. I don't read a lot of expressly humorous comics. I guess it's this and Gru. And this is very different from Gru, but I'm enjoying both of them a lot. It almost makes me want to look for more humorous comics. But anyway, and I should learn the names of the creators on this and look for their work in the future, because I think I was completely unaware of them in the past. Oh, here's Bizarro's version of the story at the beginning, also fun. Another interesting note is I read this by myself, and I still was chuckling to myself the whole time. The first issue I read out loud with my daughter, and that, of course, helps make things very funny. But my daughter was in too much of a rush, and she read this by herself. And this is one of the first times she read a whole comic book by herself. So that was awesome. Although I will weep when the time I don't get to read comics with my daughter comes. But I assume that's still a couple years off. Okay, and something I could not possibly read with my daughter, or I would be an idiot to read this with my daughter. Uh, you thought they couldn't top themselves in Airboy 1. Well, they topped themselves here with Gross Out, or not Gross Out, but Shockers, and particularly shocking because they put themselves in the story. We got the flopping penises as they run around naked. And we've got the oral sex in bathrooms at a bar that specializes in transsexuals and transvestites. Now, I can totally see why transsexuals would be insulted by the portrayal in here. I don't know anything about that world. It seems like there's an element of hackery to this, even though, it's not a serious portrayal of the world, even though he is a character in it. The rest of the world is just there to add to the joke and to add to the shock value. So it's only the shock value of transvestites and transsexuals that he's interested in. But I totally see why that community was upset by this issue. And I imagine that he could have written it in such a way that he hinted more that there's more going on than his idiot characters realize in the world of transsexuals, and that it's just a place where you go get drunk and get blowjobs is not all it's about. But that's all he portrayed here. And its whole purpose was to shock us and to shock Airboy, and to put Airboy in a very compromising position. So if you can accept that, I mean, in the first issue, the only woman, well, no, there was his ex-wife who was not happy with him, and then there was a woman they pick up at the bar whose only purpose was to have them have a threesome. So he's going to treat everybody who's not him this way. It'll be interesting to see there's only 2 more issues left. I have a feeling this is a pretty big hit, so I don't know if we'll see more of this. He wrote an apology and said that he has this deep respect for the transsexual community. So maybe he'll do more comics like this, but with more sensitivity. I'm really torn because I like I enjoy the underground ribaldry, and it's hard to do that without hurting everybody's feelings, I guess. But there should be a way to do it without hurting everyone's feelings. Okay. On to, I'll just briefly mention Kaiju Max. I was reluctant's the wrong word, but I was pretty much thinking I wouldn't stick with this because of the $3.99. But now I feel it's such and it's a little depressing because it's a prison story, even though it involves monsters. But I can't really resist. Oh, wait a second. Is this issue 1? Well, I read issue 3. And Kaiju Max is going to be kind of a sprawling soap opera kind of story. Prison soap opera kind of story with all these fantasy elements mixed in, and I can't resist seeing what he's going to do with each issue. And I've also discovered that Xander Cannon is posting online like hour-long issue commentaries. I don't know when I'll have time to listen and reread, but I plan to do that eventually. The one I listened to about 20 minutes of one, and it was full of interesting thoughts of what goes into his creating of these stories. Excuse me. Injection. I've been complaining about this one, but still getting it. I'm definitely going to keep up this issue. gave me much more information. It didn't give me all the information, but now I understand some more about the characters and starting to see the connections between them. And I'm really interested. I feel like the art is deeper into its groove, the coloring and art both working better. So I'd say Warren Ellis now has me hooked by issue 3. I'm guessing by issue 5 I'll have enough footing like I would in a normal story by issue 1. But anyway, this is well worth following. Annihilator finished up with a extra fat issue, which they still charge the same amount for. Hint, hint, lesson to DC and Marvel. I can see all the pieces of how Grant Morrison wrapped it up, but it felt like a very chaotic wrap up to a story. I think I was following and hooked into the first 5 issues, and on this wrap up I had to struggle more. It was a weaker issue. It felt like Morrison could have done an extra draft in his scripting. I gather that's not the way he does things. He'll throw out bits at the artist, and then he'll throw out another page and another page. So there isn't like careful rewriting, but it could have been tightened up in a lot of ways. And so that we kind of pay for that in this issue. It's still worth reading, but it's a bit of a, I don't know. It's just like he threw everything at the wall in the last issue. And some of the things seem a little bit like easy outs into the predicament he created for himself. I don't know if I would like another Annihilator series. I mean, at the end, I don't think this is a spoiler. It says Max Nomax will return in The Devil's Walk. But that's at a movie theater. It doesn't have to. It's just sort of that idea that Max Nomax is a serial character doesn't mean there has to be another comic book. He's a serial character in the world of this book, where he is both a fictional character and perhaps the creator of our universe, which is a lot of fun, but was not done in as clear and a well-organized way as I felt it could have been, and as I felt the earlier issues implied it would be put together. A lot of comic books don't end that great. A lot of science fiction stories in prose or in movies don't end that great either. I think it's hard to end science fiction, and when you're on your wild Philip K. Dick plus other things kind of ride here, that's hard. But still, I had high expectations. The Spire is a really cool new comic from Simon Spurrier and Jeff Stokely and a great colorist, Andre May, from Boom. And I always hesitate to get the $3.99 books, and I definitely don't want to do it from Marvel and DC. But this was a very chunky story. I think it was about 28 pages. And within those 28 pages, they gave us a lot of story. It kind of combined a kind of familiar police, corrupt city, noirish story with a cool fantasy city, this Spire, and lots of cool different creatures here, and also a slightly familiar sort of social setup where there's these freaks who have a lower social standing, although they're kind of like mutants and X-Men in a way. Some of them have powers or other things. Anyway, the non-standard people have a lower status, and they're obviously playing with that along with the police procedural and the fighting the corrupt system and everything. So there's a lot of familiar things thrown together, but with this fantasy setting that, while not totally unfamiliar from fantasy in general, is something we don't get too often in comics here in the U.S. So I'm definitely on board with this. I think it's a very fun comic book. Another fantasy comic book, or at least as much as I can tell it's fantasy. I suppose it could prove to be science fiction, is Arclight 8 House with script by Brandon Graham and art by his girlfriend, I believe, Marilyn Churchland. Her art's pretty cool. It's not what you see in comic books too often, or at least in comic books that you get at your comic book store. It's a bit more storybook like, and a bit more, I don't know what's the right word, a bit more like maybe something you'd see in gallery art, if that makes sense. I liked it, and I'm intrigued, but I can't tell what the story is here, or if there's a story. Yeah, you know what? There's this cool character here. It also seems like maybe all the characters are female, or maybe they're all just very feminine looking. I mean, here we have one that doesn't have breasts, as far as I can tell, and this one does have breasts. But both of them have a brow like a woman. Men's brows always have this ridge. I think there's a anatomical term for it. And most artists know to draw a bit of a ridge. I don't have like a super pronounced ridge, but more than a woman would. And I'm having trouble turning my head profile and looking at myself. Yeah, so that's always a clue about someone's biological sex, whether they're transgender or not. But anyway, if you're an artist drawing men and women, you should give men a brow bone, or whatever you call it. But I don't know if that's the artist not thinking of that, or trying, and just trying to make gender kind of hard to tell, or whether it is a world of just women who are knights and such. I'm trying to think if the word he is well, here's someone who looks like a standard man in this picture. So yeah, I guess it's not a world of just women. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff to figure out about this. We are given very little so far in issue 1. I'm intrigued, and I'll keep getting it. I enjoy the art, and there is some art at the back by Brandon Graham, I guess. It doesn't even seem connected to the main story. But I don't know if any of you have read any Jack Vance, but somehow it reminds me of like science fantasy far future stories by Jack Vance. Speaking of science fiction, Descender, issue 5 was a big jump up. I enjoyed it a lot more than the last 2 issues, which felt kind of repetitive and like not much happened. We're getting more into the politics and intrigue between the planets. It's not that sophisticated. One planet is obviously a planet of bad guys who look like pigs with scary teeth, which is kind of an oversimplification. But still, we've got fun with bad guys, and we've got an interesting revelation. We got some nice character beats from the Robot Boy and from some other people. So I wasn't planning to drop Descender anyway, but it was kind of a weaker book for me, and my interest has jumped up a bit. I still don't entirely trust Jeff Lemire because of the end of his last science fiction comic. What was that called? The one from Vertigo, that had a lot of the upside down stuff that Jeff Lemire drew himself. That was so cool for like the first 5 issues, and then became terrible at the end. So yeah, it's funny though, I'm not getting used to the watercolor painted art. Each time I pick this back up, it takes me a while to suspend my disbelief, if you will, and enter this fantasy science fiction world. It still seems like the wrong style for this story to me, although I think it would be an interesting style for a different kind of story. I feel like this kind of story needs its different planets and realities to have a more sort of concreteness to them. Speaking of concreteness, I read and somewhat enjoyed Thor's by Jason Aaron. I think Jason Aaron's a really good writer, and I think he takes all the curves that being a commercial writer at Marvel throws at him and makes the best of them. So he's made something interesting out of this Battle World Thor's, but it's still a very minor story and doesn't reflect the best of Jason Aaron. He was doing such good stuff on the 2 Thor series he did before. I can't wait for that to start back up rather than him kind of wasting his energies on these things. Although hopefully he's making extra bucks from it. It does have lots of nice, fun touches that, touch back to all the different Thors. And it has nice, solid artwork by Chris Sprouse that sadly is terribly colored, so that we miss out on seeing a lot of the artwork by the way it's obscured by the colors. I don't know what that's about, you'd think. Anyway, I think someone at Marvel likes that kind of coloring, because I've seen that in some other Marvel books. Anyway, I get this as a continuation of my Thor mail subscription, so I will presumably get all of Thor's. I'm mildly curious about the mystery involved. I'm mildly having fun with the police procedural being done by a bunch of different Thors. It's kind of weird seeing like Storm of the X-Men as a Thor. It's fun to see the Destroyer as a Thor. I kind of like the idea of this bar where the Thors hang out. There's another example of the coloring that kind of obscures the art. It just occurred to me, it's a bit like Top 10 by Alan Moore, if that makes sense to people who've read that. Yeah. Okay, one more comic. Let's see. Yeah, I've gone on for over 30 minutes. But, if you're one of my best friends, you'll still be watching. Midnighter is, I'm going to drop Midnighter. It had a different artist this issue. People complained about that. I thought this artist was very good. In many ways, I liked him better than ACO, and I like ACO a lot. So I was very happy with the art. But I don't like the character of Midnighter here. He resorts to violence far too quickly. There's got to be some more clever way to deal with anti-gay, older, middle-aged men in a bar in Russia who ask you to leave because you're gay, then just grab them by the nose and start beating them up. I mean, judging from what we see here, he's done extreme damage to these people for their homophobia, and that might be a nice fantasy for some people, but I just don't like that in my superheroes, and it just seems like violence is the answer to everything here, and I'm just not in the mood for that. Maybe I'll pick up Midnighter at some point in the future. Maybe he'll advance beyond that. And it also, I think someone else I heard reviewing said it felt like this had skipped ahead, like we'd missed an issue. The boyfriend from last issue is gone, and there's a new boyfriend, and I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of putting down a good comic book, but I got to read other things, and I just don't like Midnighter's. I don't support the approach of solving all problems by beating the hell out of people, especially when you have other options. So I'll talk to you all later.